The Brexit issue is very important in terms of national sovereignty and the freedom of the UK to determine its own future. It is really not that complicated to understand if all the facts are presented honestly. The British exit from the European Union was determined by a referendum on June 23rd of 2016, in which people of the United Kingdom voted 52% to 48% in favour of leaving the EU. On March 29th of 2017, the then Prime Minister, or the existing Prime Minister, Theresa May, invoked Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, something that all member states had to agree to, and more about that in another video, which gave her government 2 years to negotiate the UK departure from the EU. The process is far from complete, and we have passed the deadline of that 2-year period last week on March 29th of this year. And at the moment there's an extension till April the 12th, with a possible further extension till May 22nd, before the EU elections. Now, there are a number of important background factors to be considered, because, as you know, all is not always as it seems, and never more so than in politics. So before we launch into the interview with Stuart Young, I just want to bear in mind, I just want to illustrate 6 points which I think are very, very important to the overall understanding of this whole Brexit issue. Number one, if we assume that the vote was genuine, it was a surprise result for many. It contradicted the seemingly inexorable move towards the great European superstate that seems to be the overall agenda being plugged. And I think it was a surprise result that the British people reacted against that. We know that there are big players within the establishment, the powers that shouldn't be, if you like, who would like more and more integration and less sovereignty for the individual nations of Europe. There are powerful hidden forces who don't want us to leave. That is the point. Point number two, it's reasonable to expect that there is pressure from these unseen quarters to reverse this decision made by the people of the British Isles. The Brexit procedure can only really have been designed effectively to be very manipulatable, to be able to manoeuvre the result around, to be unachievable, for these 2 important points. Firstly, the requirement for the UK Prime Minister to strike a deal with the negotiating team for the EU, who don't want us to leave, for a very, very important point. So she's struggling, the British Prime Minister has been struggling to negotiate leaving. This is a kind of a nonsense, really. If we vote to leave, the government should respect that, and we leave. We don't ask the people we're leaving how we can leave and expect them to agree, because they don't want us to leave. Very important point. And then that agreement, struck with somebody who doesn't want us to leave, so it's never really going to be a good agreement, then needs to be ratified by the whole UK government in Parliament to make it legitimate. And that includes all the people that actually don't want us to leave voting and being able to scupper this whole process. So that's the second point I want to make. The third is that, on the other hand, there's a considerable part of the British Conservative Party in the UK Parliament under Theresa May's leadership that does value our sovereignty and is committed to delivering this Brexit, even without any deal. Although, interestingly, there are moves now to make leaving without a deal illegal, and I refer you back to the previous 2 points. So this outcome, leaving with no deal, has all the negative effects trumpeted, of course, and without mentioning any of the positive outcomes. I'll come back to that point in a minute. But the point is that no deal is currently the only result that gets the UK out of the EU. Leaving with no deal, simply walking, is the only way to achieve our British sovereignty. And this, it kind of explains why MPs who are genuine leavers must vote against this deal. And it looks irrational, it looks like nonsense on the surface, but really it's not. Point number 4 is that the EU has morphed into something that it's not. It was sold to us as an European economic community, a trading club. It's now a political union, a superstate. It's got its own flag, government, armed forces, and even an anthem. So the point here is the British people were lied to when they were sold the idea of being in a European economic community by Ted Heath in 1973 or 1975, I'm not sure. It was always intended to become a political union. Important point. Point number 5 is that it's a classic case of not presenting the entire balanced and honest argument that I alluded to a moment ago. The advantages of political sovereignty and self-determination seem to have been swept away and out of the conversation. But the advantages of political union, of staying in, have been hammed up to the limit. Similarly, the disadvantages of leaving are exaggerated. This woeful state where prices will rise and there'll be chaos. It's exaggerated, and the disadvantages of remaining in Europe are ignored. The fact that we have no self-determination, we're going to lose more and more of our sovereignty, giving up our national currency and a whole bunch of other things. So this is a really important point to take note of. Lastly here is that the overall plan for the EU is essentially a collectivist socialist superstate with open borders allowing unrestricted migration between member states. This poses problems for the UK, which has suffered an enormous amount of immigration and deeply concerns many people here. Now, the racist card is what's played in response to this. It's their main weapon, and it is disingenuous. People who are concerned about immigration, who are concerned about self-determination, are not being racist. This is mixing issues, and it is a false presentation of the argument. It is disingenuous, it is sneaky, and we must all be aware of it. So to summarise then, just before we go on to the interview, the deal on the table for the British government at the moment, the one they're voting for, although it looks like a Leave result, it really isn't. It involves a temporary customs union that can potentially last indefinitely. And if we're in a great big customs block with the EU, we haven't left. And this is why so many genuine Leavers, as mentioned earlier, have had to vote against the deal. Leaving with this deal is not leaving. So the UK Independence Party were largely credited with presenting the persuasive case to the British public back in 2016, illustrating our lack of sovereignty if we remain in the EU. And earlier I interviewed Stuart Young of the Leicester UKIP to gain a better understanding of the arguments for leaving and to get a clearer picture of the whole process and its likely outcome. So I hope you enjoy the interview. It's a great pleasure to be joined by Stuart Young, who is branch chairman of UKIP Leicester, and he's also shortly to stand as a candidate for the mayor of Leicester on behalf of UKIP. And today's purpose is to discuss the Brexit issue and try and shed some light on this topic that few people seem to understand. So Stuart, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Nigel.
Perhaps we can kick off with when did the EU begin, or when did the UK join?
Well, the UK joined in 1973. It was the treaty session was actually 1972, done by a certain Ted Heath, who was the leader of the Conservative Party then. We wasn't offered a choice. We were put in without a referendum. The referendum was then held by the Labour Party in 75. Harold Wilson held a referendum, and that was to keep us in. In my opinion, if you're already in and asking someone a positive, which is a yes, would you like to stay in? Yes, rather than would you like to join, kind of thing. The status quo effect, it keeps people more inclined to go the way they want it. So yeah, we held the referendum, and of course the whole of the referendum in 75 was about the trading bloc. We were promised there would be no political union. This would just be about trade. Sounded pretty good, so we had a 2/3 majority to stay in what was the European Communities.
Yes.
Back then, the
European Community, yes.
Yes, not the European Union.
No. So that leads into another point, really, which is it's morphed, isn't it? It's no longer the EEC, the European Economic Community. It's now the European Union.
Ever changing and keeps changing. Yep. If you go through the 70s and into the 80s, we had the Treaty of Rome in 85, which brought in the Single European Act and the birth of the European Union. Exactly.
So fast forward to today, really, with all of these changes, with all of these political additions and evolutions, if you like, into the sort of super state that we have today. And or let's come up to 3 years ago in 2016, when, of course, we had the referendum on Thursday, 23rd of June of 2016, in which the Leave campaign, which I think was largely on the back of the ideas and thinking of the UKIP party, the Leave campaign won by 52% to 48%, and that was with about 72% turnout, with more
very high turnout.
Yeah, more than 30 million people voting out of 60 million or so. So this was the decision of the British people to leave on the back of the, would you say it's true to say on the back of the argument presented by UKIP?
Well, the Ashcroft polling after the during the referendum, which took place on the day, suggested the primary reason was sovereignty for people. The primary reason for people voting to remain was the economy. The primary reason for people voting to leave was the sovereignty issue. So okay. Yeah, the ideals of the birth of UKIP was definitely there. Yeah. So
then we've got, just to fast forward through this process, we've got Theresa May then invoking Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, something that we'll be talking about in an upcoming episode, in which gave us 2 years to negotiate our leaving of this European Union.
UKIP's position was just to leave, by the way.
Yeah,
they made a proposal. Gerard Batten, the current leader, said we just reversed the European Act. Bang, we're out.
Absolutely.
And the legislation will still be in place. If you want to talk about that later, go on.
Yeah, no, that's very, very relevant. I mean, the idea of negotiating one's departure seems odd. You know, it seems like you go to a party and you're asking someone permission if you can leave, and you've got to stay and do the washing up, and you've got to pay for all the food before you leave.
Of course,
I think it is odd in the minds of most people. So the deal, the so-called deal in the media that we hear about that Theresa May negotiated, obviously widely unliked by people on both sides or all parts of the political spectrum here in the UK. And
she managed to unify the country, yes.
So it's essentially this 2-year period to negotiate a £39 billion divorce bill, so-called. And I think the other two essential points are UK citizens in the EU and EU citizens in the UK would be allowed to retain their rights of residency and social security after Brexit. And also this sort of main stumbling block, point 4 of the deal, was no hard border in Ireland with the so-called backstop. The rejection of this so-called deal on January the 15th and the subsequent rejections in more recent votes has caused this whole Brexit issue to be pushed further and further into the future. And we're now looking at we obviously passed March 29th, which was the end of the 2-year deadline for Brexit. And I understand at the moment we have this temporary extension to April 12th with a probable extension until May 22nd, just prior to the European elections. So, Stuart, is there really a big problem if we leave without a deal? I mean, you made a comment just a minute ago there that rather suggests there isn't.
I've always struggled with the concept that leaving the European Union will be a disaster for our economy. It's a trading arrangement. Trump pulled America out of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Alliance, like that, and their economy picked up according to their official figures. I'll leave that one aside anyway. But there was no real damage done. And if you could, countries leave trading blocks, enter in and leave all the time.
Yeah.
There's no disasters. I'm struggling with the concept that leaving the single market would implode the country. This cliff edge scaremongering, I am really struggling with it.
Yeah.
WTO is not World Trade Organization rules, is your default position, and trade is trade. Trade will carry on happening regardless. It's not going to be the end of the world, in my opinion, no way near. And the freedom we gain from that in terms of trade with the rest of the world will be immense, because this isolationist block of the single market with the high tariff walls, for me, is the reason why we should be leaving, and the trade argument. But they're using trade, the Remain camp, as the big reason to stay. Okay. And I think it's the other way around.
So at the moment there are tariffs around the EU trading bloc which is it fair to say hamper our ability to strike deals with other countries elsewhere in the world?
Oh, without a doubt, and it promotes bad and inefficient market conditions as well. So bad companies that could be doing better are allowed to stay afloat when and it hits the consumer in the pocket.
Do you think that it's likely that this procedure of going to the EU to negotiate our own departure and then bringing that back and having to present that to the UK Parliament, and then they've all got to agree on the specifics of a deal, do you think that's likely designed to give a get-out clause for this decision the UK people have made?
Well, of course, it's a browbeating exercise, in my opinion. Bore the public to death with it. I mean, you're hearing all the time now people have had enough. They just want to leave or have it done. Carry on, pounding and pounding. And, of course, this is just the negotiation for the withdrawal. It's not the negotiation for our next trading arrangement. And this has been going on for a long time. And the news covers it every minute of every day, deliberately. And for me, I'm looking at it, scratching my head, thinking, if you're not going to talk about the political side of it all, which they rarely do,
no.
which there's a reason why they don't, and they're just talking about the economic side,
yeah.
I'm still scratching my head with it all. And for me, it had just been reverse the Communities Act, the European Union Communities Act from the House of Parliament. All the legislation we currently have with the European Union stays in place, so there's no disruption. You know, we just carry on as we are, and then we start untangling it as we go. And we'll just say bye, we'll see you, we'll leave. If you want access to our market without tariffs, come and talk to us. If you don't want that, that's fine. Trump's waiting, so's the rest of the world, and so's the Commonwealth.
Indeed, and the amount of propaganda is so barefaced and obvious. The BBC is very, the main British Broadcasting Corporation here in the UK is very
state TV.
Yeah, state TV.
I can't believe a country in the Western world such as ours has state propaganda TV. I'm still amazed. But carry on. Sorry, Nigel.
No, a valid interjection. The BBC is very pro-Remain, and anyone can read this into what they're saying with just a modicum of reading between the lines. And also, shockingly, on another major news outlet here in the UK, Channel 4 News, we had Jon Snow saying at a recent rally in London that he'd never seen so many white people. Now, this is a shocking statement which conjures up the racism card, doesn't it? The hidden implication there being that we're all racist and that we're trying to exclude people of a different skin colour, which of course is not the issue at all. It's disingenuously mixing issues.
Outstanding, really. I mean, has he never been to Glastonbury? I mean, it's like, or Wimbledon, or Wembley in an FA Cup final.
Yeah.
I mean, just to use the race card alone is staggering beyond belief.
Yeah.
The people of Britain are the people of Britain. You know, I don't understand what skin colour's got to do with anything.
Exactly.
Personally. And that was just a cheap, nasty, vindictive little hit, which was completely out of order. And the shame it's meant to inflict on people who voted leave is, in my opinion, backfiring.
And as you rightly point out, the propaganda continues. It's all over the news, morning TV. Only this morning I watched a little bit. I happened to be down at the barber shop, and I watched a little bit where they're again they're hamming up the economic consequences of leaving without a deal or leaving in general, the whole economic uncertainty. And as you've pointed out, there would actually be advantages if we just walked straight away. So do you think there's likely to be a second referendum, given all of this shenanigans with the deal and the extensions and the so on?
If I'm honest with you, Nigel, I'm struggling to read it. I like to usually think I'm quite good at anticipating what the next steps will be. They keep surprising me. It's quite clearly designed, though, to just drag it out. Make 2016 becomes 2026 and we're still here. And then that'll be when it'd be justified to have this second referendum. I think if they do it now, it'll be too dangerous for them. But long term, down the line, they could. So for me, I think they're just planning to draw it out and draw it out and draw it out and draw it out, with an eventual second referendum after they've agreed the trading agreements, which is still to come because they're still discussing the withdrawal agreement now. So for me, that's when they'll probably do it.
Yeah. The ground is definitely being laid for that. I was watching a presenter on the news just the other day saying that, the situation has changed, she said quite innocently, from 2016.
Well, of course.
Is it still appropriate?
We now know what Brexit looks like. No, we now know what the Theresa May's Brexit looks like. We now know what the Remain's Brexit looks like. And we actually now know what the European Union's Brexit looked like. I must also say that we were offered a free trade deal at the beginning, well, a version of the Canada-style free trade agreement, which would have satisfied a lot of Brexiteers. The European Union, to be fair to them, offered that. Theresa May said no for whatever reason she said no for. I'll let you read into that what you want.
Yes, and it's difficult to understand why her first vote, which I think was scheduled in December, the 10th of December or something, or around about that time, she delayed the vote on the acceptance of the deal, apparently because she thought the timing was wrong and it would be overwhelmingly defeated. The vote was then subsequently had on January the 15th, which would seem like just a pointless delay because it was then massively defeated. So again, you see this ongoing picture of delay and procrastination, and in the whole context of things, it's difficult to not conclude that, as you say, this is disingenuous and leading towards another referendum and a reversal of the decision by the UK people.
Possibly, but I do honestly think that she will somehow hammer her withdrawal agreement through. Whether it's implemented or not is another question. I still think that because the withdrawal agreement, if you know all about it, it's got a lot of nasty little things in it. Like we can't leave that without the European Union's blessing. So there are big issues there. I personally, because we have an out with Article 50, or if UKIP became the government of this country, we'll just reverse the Communities Act and leave under British law. But we have an out with the international law with the current setup of remaining in the European Union. This new Withdrawal Act is a new treaty. It's not a deal, it's a treaty. The European Union very much see it as a treaty. And they have the say, because both parties have to agree when that treaty ends. So the international law is on their side to keep us in. Of course, we have to keep paying all that fiat currency over to them in the process.
I understand the main reason that most MPs are against the deal as negotiated by Theresa May is this so-called Irish backstop, in which, to avoid a hard border, an actual physical wall between Northern Ireland and Ireland that remains in the EU, the backstop does require that in Northern Ireland, the UK part of the island of Ireland, it does get ridiculous, doesn't it? I mean, it points to the ridiculousness of Northern Ireland really being a part of the UK, but that's a whole other subject. But given that we have what we have, Northern Ireland part of the UK, Northern Ireland is now required to have some degree of alignment with the EU on things like food products and various goods standards, and this would prevent the need for checks on the Irish border, but it would require some products brought to Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK to be subject to new checks and controls. And I think this is what upsets the DUP and various other political parties represented in the UK Parliament. They don't want to weaken the union, if you like, and if there starts to be some, you could arguably make the case that such an arrangement where there have to be checks and things, where things legitimately coming from London over to Dublin, to Belfast, would have to be subject to these specific checks. So that appears to be quite a big stumbling block, doesn't it? The backstop would also involve a temporary single customs territory, effectively keeping the whole of the UK in the EU customs union. And if future trade talks broke down, I believe, without a deal, the backstop would apply indefinitely. And this arrangement would end only with the agreement of both the UK and the EU. So there's a problem for a start in terms of us being eternally locked in a customs union. And of course, a customs union essentially means we're still part of the EU. I mean, you cannot be a sovereign nation and yet be subject to a customs union across 28 other countries in the European Union.
Yeah, you can't blame the DUP really at all. I mean, they're representing their constituents who are pro the union, and their primary obligation is to remain part of the United Kingdom, and this backstop separates Northern Ireland from the United Kingdom, keeps them in the European Union in a way, and the United Kingdom technically, I don't buy either, not in the European Union, but the Brino part, Brexit in name only for people who don't know. There is the Malthouse Compromise being pitched in Parliament. I'm not a big fan of that, but it basically sets up the process of having a free trade agreement between Northern Ireland and the UK, even though we're part of the same union, to bypass the backstop. It's a bit complicated. I mean, we just should have a free trade agreement, full stop. I mean, that would solve the whole mess. So UKIP's position basically is that this has all been blown out of all proportion. The media are hammering it out. So are the politicians, especially those about Remain. It will be a situation for two sovereign nations, hopefully one being sovereign and the other not, just to put up an agreement. There's no need for a hard border. Seriously, not when you're doing trade. So I think it is just it's something to beat the United Kingdom over the head with, in my opinion.
Do you think it's likely that the Brexit process, this ongoing, drawn-out, we could say, a process, being extended to the 22nd of May, and then, of course, we've got European elections, which would be completely irrelevant for people here in the United Kingdom to be involved in. Do you think it's likely that we're going to see that push beyond that deadline?
Yeah, without a doubt. The European elections, I don't think we'll be allowed to have them, if I'm honest. I'm only making my own judgments on my view of how things are going. But there has been a lot of talk that the current crop of MEPs will have a increased mandate to stay as like overseers of our representation there while we negotiate our way out of the European Union. To allow European Union elections would, for my opinion, create too much opposition to the establishment parties. So I doubt very much they will allow it. So there will be an extension. They will play down how long the extension will be, and the need then for European Union elections, because they won't be serving a full term. So they will just allow the current crop to stay on as they are, in my opinion.
Do you mean the current crop of members of the European Parliament, MEPs in this country?
Yeah, the present UK members of European Parliament that are there now, yeah. Which UKIP won in 2014, by the way.
Yeah, okay. I hope this has helped shed some light for those of you listening. I do hope you'll join us. We've got a next clip coming up, next part of this discussion, in which I hope Stuart's going to shed some light on the case for UK independence. So thanks for listening to this one. Catch up with us on the next episode.